The late afternoon sun cast its golden rays across the quiet suburban street, painting the scene with an almost serene glow. Jasmine Carter sat in her unassuming sedan, the engine idling as she checked her watch. Dressed in a faded hoodie and jeans, she looked like any other woman driving home from work. But Jasmine wasn't just anyone. Beneath her casual exterior was a sharp, confident FBI agent, embedded deep undercover in a high-stakes operation involving a dangerous trafficking ring. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, displaying a text from her handler, "Stay low. You're in the clear for now." Jasmine let out a soft breath, brushing a few strands of curly hair away from her face. This assignment had been taxing, weeks of playing a role, gathering intel, and constantly looking over her shoulder. She longed for the moment when this operation would finally be over, and she could return to her real life. But she knew better than to let her guard down, even in the quietest of moments. As she merged onto a tree-lined avenue, the distinct flash of blue and red lights lit up her rearview mirror. Her heart sank. A police cruiser tailed her, its siren chirping briefly before the officer hit the loudspeaker. "Driver, pull over to the right. Now." Jasmine tightened her grip on the wheel, her pulse quickening. She knew this part of town too well, a place notorious for its overly aggressive law enforcement. Her mind raced as she guided her car to the curb. She had done nothing wrong, yet a familiar sense of dread crept over her. Taking a deep breath, she whispered to herself, "Stay calm, Jasmine. Stay in control." The cruiser parked behind her, and a tall, broad-shouldered officer emerged. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the sunlight, obscuring his eyes, but not his expression. Even from a distance, Jasmine could feel the hostility radiating off him. Officer Greg Simmons, a name she had heard in whispered complaints from locals, approached her car with measured, deliberate steps. "License and registration," he barked, his tone sharp and uncompromising. Jasmine rolled down her window, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Greg's lips curled into a smirk, though there was no humor in it. "I'll ask the questions. License and registration. Now." Jasmine nodded, reaching into the glove compartment for her registration and pulling her wallet from her pocket. "Here you go," she said, handing over the documents. Her voice was steady, but her instincts were on high alert. Greg glanced at her license, then back at her. "Jasmine Carter," he said slowly, as if testing the name on his tongue. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" "I'm on my way home," Jasmine replied evenly. "I haven't broken any laws." Greg leaned down, peering into her car as though searching for something, anything, to justify his growing suspicion. "This area's got a lot of crime lately. You seem out of place." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Out of place? I wasn't aware driving down a public street was a crime." Greg's jaw tightened, and he stepped back, his hand resting on the holster of his service weapon. "You're awfully confident for someone I just pulled over. Step out of the vehicle." Jasmine hesitated. "Officer, I've complied with all your requests. Is there a specific reason you're asking me to step out?" "Don't question my orders." Greg snapped, his voice rising. "Out of the car, now." Suppressing a sigh, Jasmine opened the door and stepped out, her movements measured and deliberate. She stood tall, her posture calm but commanding. At 5'10", she wasn't easily intimidated, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her. Greg circled her like a predator sizing up its prey. "Where are you really coming from? Got anything illegal in the car?" "I told you," Jasmine said patiently, "I'm on my way home. And no, there's nothing illegal in my car." Greg's eyes narrowed. "You people always have a story." Jasmine's composure faltered for just a moment. "You people?" she repeated, her tone sharp. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Greg smirked again, though his expression was colder this time. "Don't play dumb. You fit the profile." Jasmine's anger simmered beneath the surface, but she knew better than to let it boil over. "Officer Simmons," she said carefully, "I know my rights. If you're accusing me of something, I'd like to know what it is. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, Greg said abruptly, grabbing her arm and twisting it behind her back before she could respond. Jasmine didn't resist, but her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made him pause. Obstruction? Are you serious? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. I've done nothing wrong. You're resisting now, Greg added, tightening the cuffs around her wrists. Jasmine's expression remained calm, though her voice carried a sharp edge. You're making a big mistake. Greg froze for a split second, the weight of her words sinking in. But he quickly shrugged it off, shoving her toward the back seat of his cruiser. As the door slammed shut behind her, Jasmine stared out the window, her mind racing through her next steps. She knew one thing for sure: Greg Simmons had just entangled himself in a storm far bigger than he could imagine. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed faintly, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the dimly lit room. Jasmine Carter sat at the center of the interrogation table, her hands cuffed behind her back, her posture erect and unyielding. Despite the circumstances, she exuded an aura of quiet strength, her dark eyes calmly scanning the room, taking in every detail: the scuffed floors, the cracked tiles, the faint smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. Across from her, Greg Simmons leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face split into a smug grin. He radiated confidence, the kind that comes from years of unchecked authority. To him, this was just another day, a routine show of power. But to Jasmine, it was a dance she had rehearsed many times before, albeit in a different context. So, Greg said, breaking the silence. Let's start with the basics. Who are you really, Jasmine Carter? Or is that even your real name? Jasmine tilted her head slightly, her expression impassive. You've already seen my license, officer. Everything you need is there. Greg chuckled, a hollow sound that filled the room. Oh, I don't buy that for a second. You don't belong here. So why don't you save us both some time and tell me what you're really doing in that neighborhood? Jasmine leaned back in her chair, as much as the cuffs allowed. What exactly do you think I was doing? Robbing a house? Selling drugs? Or is simply existing while black enough to set off your alarms? Greg's smirk faltered, just for a moment. His ego wouldn't allow her to rattle him. Watch your tone, he snapped, pushing off the wall and stepping closer. You're in no position to mouth off. The door to the interrogation room swung open, and another officer stepped inside, a younger man with a cautious expression. Officer Daniels, Greg's partner for the day, had watched the arrest unfold with growing unease. Now, he carried that discomfort into the room. Greg, Daniels said hesitantly, can I talk to you for a minute? Outside. Greg shot him an annoyed glance, but followed him out, leaving the door ajar. Jasmine could still hear fragments of their conversation. Are you sure about this, man? Daniels asked, his voice low but firm. She doesn't seem like your typical suspect. And the arrest, it felt, off. Greg's response was dismissive. Don't tell me you're falling for her act. She's got a fake story and a bad attitude. People like her are good at playing innocent. Daniels hesitated, but Greg's unwavering arrogance silenced him. When Greg returned to the room, Jasmine was waiting, her expression unreadable. You've got some concerned colleagues, she remarked coolly. Maybe you should listen to them. Greg sneered. You think you've got allies here? Cute. You're just another perp trying to talk your way out of trouble. Jasmine leaned forward, her gaze locking onto his. You have no idea who you're dealing with, she said, her voice low but steady. But you will soon enough. Meanwhile, in a secure FBI office miles away, Agent Tomlinson's phone buzzed with an urgent notification. He frowned as he read the report: Agent Jasmine Carter arrested in civilian capacity. Local precinct. Immediate intervention required. Tomlinson swore under his breath and immediately sprang into action. Jasmine's operation was classified, but her arrest was a breach of protocol that could unravel months of painstaking work. Within moments, the wheels were set in motion. Calls were made, strings were pulled, and a high-ranking FBI official was dispatched to the precinct to quietly resolve the situation. Back in the interrogation room, the tension grew thicker. Greg continued his one-sided interrogation, peppering Jasmine with accusatory questions that she answered with unwavering composure. "Why were you driving through that neighborhood?" "I've already told you, I was on my way home." "Where's home? Or is that part of the lie too?" Jasmine sighed. "You're fishing, officer. And you're coming up empty." Greg's frustration boiled over. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Sitting there, acting like you're untouchable." "I don't think I'm smart," Jasmine said evenly. "I know it. And I know that arrogance like yours always comes at a cost." Before Greg could respond, the door swung open again, this time with more force. Lieutenant Harris, Greg's superior, entered the room with a clipboard in hand and a no-nonsense expression. Harris was a seasoned officer, his graying hair and steely demeanor commanding respect. "Greg," Harris said curtly, "step outside." "Now." Greg bristled. "I'm in the middle of." "Now," Harris repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Greg shot Jasmine a glare before leaving the room. Harris sat down across from her, setting the clipboard aside. "Miss Carter," Harris began, his voice measured. "I've been reviewing your case, and something doesn't add up. I'm inclined to believe there's been a mistake here." Jasmine's lips curled into a faint smile. "Lieutenant, you're sharper than your officer gives you credit for." Harris frowned. "Are you willing to tell me the truth about who you are and why you're here?" Jasmine's gaze held his. "With all due respect, Lieutenant, I don't owe you an explanation. But I will say this, your officer's ego has landed him in a situation far above his pay grade." Before Harris could respond, the door opened once more. This time, a sharply dressed man in a tailored suit entered the room. His presence was commanding, his badge clearly identifying him as FBI. "Agent Carter," he said with a nod, ignoring the stunned expression on Harris's face. "Let's get you out of here." Jasmine stood, her cuffs quickly removed by the agent. As she straightened her hoodie, she turned to Harris. "I suggest you have a long talk with Officer Simmons. This situation could have gone very differently." With that, she followed the agent out, leaving Harris staring after her, his mind racing with questions and a growing sense of dread. Greg Simmons, however, had no idea how much trouble was about to rain down on him. The precinct buzzed with activity as the usual hum of phones ringing and officers chatting was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black SUV. Its tinted windows and government plates made it clear, someone important was here. The air shifted, thick with tension, as the vehicle came to a stop in front of the building. Inside, Officer Greg Simmons leaned back at his desk, still radiating smugness from his earlier arrest. Jasmine Carter had been a tough nut to crack, but he was certain he'd made the right call. As far as he was concerned, she was just another liar trying to wriggle out of trouble. The door to the precinct opened, and two sharply dressed men stepped inside. Their suits were immaculate, their presence commanding. They didn't say a word as they strode past the front desk, flashing their FBI credentials to the bewildered desk sergeant. Following close behind them was Jasmine, no longer in handcuffs, her posture tall and unyielding, her expression a mask of calm confidence. The room fell silent as officers stopped what they were doing to watch the scene unfold. Whispers rippled through the precinct. "Who are they? Wait, is she FBI? Simmons is in deep trouble now." The tension in the air was palpable. Greg's smug grin faltered as he caught sight of Jasmine walking freely, flanked by federal agents. His superior, Lieutenant Harris, stood nearby, his brow furrowed as he watched the group approach. "Lieutenant Harris," one of the agents said, extending a hand. "Special Agent Turner, FBI. We need to have a word about one of your officers." Harris shook Turner's hand, his expression grim. "I figured this might be about Simmons. He's waiting over there." He nodded toward Greg, who was now visibly sweating, despite his best efforts to appear calm. Jasmine stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Before we get to him, I think it's important everyone here understands what just happened. Turner gave her a slight nod, stepping aside to let her speak. Jasmine turned, addressing the room with a steady, authoritative tone. "My name is Special Agent Jasmine Carter," she began, her voice firm and unyielding. "I've been working undercover for the past 3 months on a federal operation targeting a trafficking ring that operates in this very region. The work I've been doing has been critical in gathering evidence to dismantle this operation." The room was deathly quiet as every officer listened, their expressions a mix of shock and unease. Jasmine's gaze swept across the crowd, landing briefly on Greg, who avoided her eyes. "Yesterday, my cover was almost blown," she continued. "I had just finished meeting a key informant when I was pulled over by Officer Simmons." Her tone sharpened, each word landing like a hammer. "Despite following every protocol, despite complying with every demand, I was treated like a criminal. And let me be clear, that wasn't about law enforcement. That was about bias." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the weight of the room's gaze kept him silent. "Officer Simmons," Jasmine said, turning to him directly, "your actions didn't just humiliate me. They jeopardized months of federal work. You put lives at risk, mine, my informants, and the victims we're trying to save. All because you couldn't see past your own prejudice." Greg's face flushed red, his composure cracking. "I was doing my job," he muttered defensively. "You were acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" Jasmine cut him off, her voice rising slightly. "What exactly was suspicious? Driving through a neighborhood? Being black? Or was it the fact that I didn't cower under your scrutiny?" The room was silent again, all eyes on Greg, whose defenses were crumbling under the weight of Jasmine's words. Lieutenant Harris stepped forward, his expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Simmons," he said sharply, "you've crossed the line before, but this is inexcusable. I'll be filing a formal reprimand, and I'll personally ensure Internal Affairs reviews this incident." Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Harris held up a hand. "Don't say another word." Jasmine wasn't finished. She stepped closer to Greg, her eyes locking onto his. "You think your badge gives you power, but real power comes from integrity, from serving and protecting everyone, not just the ones who look like you or fit your mold. Today, you abused that power. And now you're going to face the consequences." Greg's face was a storm of emotions, anger, shame, and an undercurrent of fear. For the first time, he realized just how deeply he had miscalculated. Jasmine turned to Lieutenant Harris. "I trust you'll handle this appropriately. If not, I have no problem ensuring the FBI does." Harris nodded, his expression resolute. "You have my word, Agent Carter." With that, Jasmine turned on her heel, walking toward the precinct's exit. The room seemed to hold its breath as she moved, her head held high, her presence commanding. Just before she stepped out the door, she paused and glanced back at Greg. "Officer Simmons," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel, "remember this, arrogance is a weakness, not a strength. Next time, think before you act. It might save you, and others, a lot of trouble." Greg didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of his mistake was too heavy. As Jasmine stepped outside, the cool air greeted her, a welcome contrast to the stifling tension of the precinct. She inhaled deeply, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. She had endured, she had prevailed, and she had made her point. Behind her, the precinct buzzed with murmurs and activity, the fallout from Greg's actions already beginning to unfold. But Jasmine didn't look back. She had work to do, a mission to complete, and nothing, least of all a hot-headed cop, was going to stand in her way. The aftermath of the incident at the precinct was swift and unrelenting. Within days, Officer Greg Simmons found himself at the center of a storm that had spiraled far beyond his control. The disciplinary board convened an emergency meeting, and Internal Affairs launched a comprehensive investigation into Greg's history of misconduct. Every complaint, every questionable stop, every incident of racial bias that had been quietly swept under the rug was now laid bare for scrutiny. Greg sat in a sterile conference room at the precinct, flanked by his union representative and his attorney. Across the table sat a panel of stern-faced officials, including Lieutenant Harris, whose disappointment was palpable. The air was thick with tension as the lead investigator, a no-nonsense woman with piercing gray eyes, methodically listed the allegations against him. "Officer Simmons," she said, her tone sharp, "your arrest of Agent Jasmine Carter has raised significant concerns about your judgment and conduct. Furthermore, a review of your record shows a troubling pattern of complaints related to racial profiling and excessive force. Can you explain these incidents?" Greg swallowed hard, his usual bravado replaced by a suffocating sense of unease. I was just doing my job," he stammered. "I didn't know she was FBI. And those other complaints, they were exaggerated." The investigator's gaze hardened. Exaggerated or not, they paint a clear picture of a problem. A problem that this department can no longer ignore. Lieutenant Harris leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Greg, you've been given more chances than most. This time, there are no excuses. Your actions have damaged this department's reputation and endangered a federal operation. Frankly, I don't see how you come back from this." Across town, Jasmine Carter sat in a bustling cafe, her laptop open in front of her. The sound of clinking mugs and quiet conversation served as a backdrop as she typed up a formal complaint detailing her experience. It wasn't just about her own ordeal, it was about the broader issue of systemic racism in law enforcement, a problem she was determined to confront head-on. When she finished, Jasmine leaned back in her chair and exhaled deeply. The document was thorough and damning, outlining not only her encounter with Greg but also the countless stories she'd heard from others during her time undercover. She attached evidence, statistics, and recommendations for reform before hitting send. The complaint made its way up the chain of command, eventually landing on the desk of the police commissioner. Within days, it became the catalyst for an internal review of department policies and practices. Jasmine's decision to speak out didn't stop there. She leveraged her connections to bring the story to light. The media quickly picked up the story, and it spread like wildfire. News outlets ran headlines like, "FBI agent arrested by local officer sparks outrage and racial bias in policing under fire after high-profile incident." Social media erupted, with hashtags like #JusticeForJasmine and #ReformThePolice trending for days. The public demanded accountability, and protests formed outside the precinct, calling for Greg's termination and systemic change. Amid the growing outrage, Jasmine agreed to an interview with a national news anchor. Sitting in a sleek studio, under bright lights, she spoke with calm authority. "This isn't just about one bad cop," Jasmine said. "This is about a system that allows, and even enables this kind of behavior. I was lucky, I had the resources and the platform to fight back. But what about the countless people who don't? What about those who are silenced or ignored? This has to change." Her words resonated deeply, sparking a national conversation about the need for reform. Officers from other departments began to come forward, sharing their own experiences with discriminatory practices and toxic cultures within law enforcement. A few even credited Jasmine's bravery for inspiring them to speak out. Back at the precinct, Greg found himself increasingly isolated. His colleagues kept their distance, some out of anger, others out of fear of association. The weight of public scrutiny and the investigation bore down on him, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth: this wasn't just about one mistake. It was about years of choices that had hurt people and tarnished the badge he once held with pride. Alone in his small apartment one evening, Greg stared at the television as Jasmine's interview replayed. Her words cut through him like a knife, stirring a mix of guilt and shame he couldn't ignore. For the first time, he began to question not just his actions, but the mindset that had driven them. The next morning, Greg requested a meeting with Lieutenant Harris. Sitting across from his superior in a private office, he spoke haltingly but earnestly. "I messed up," Greg admitted, his voice heavy with regret. Not just with Agent Carter, but in a lot of ways. I see that now. I don't know if I can fix this, but I want to try. Harris regarded him for a long moment before responding. Acknowledging your mistakes is a start, but words aren't enough, Simmons. If you're serious about making amends, you'll need to prove it, not just to me, but to the community you've wronged. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued to use her platform to advocate for change. She partnered with local organizations to host town halls, where community members shared their stories and proposed solutions. She also worked with law enforcement officials who were committed to reform, facilitating workshops on implicit bias and accountability. During one of these events, a young officer approached Jasmine, his expression nervous but determined. "Agent Carter," he said, "I just wanted to thank you. What you're doing, it's making a difference. It's making me want to be better." Jasmine smiled, her resolve strengthened. "That's the goal," she replied. "Change starts with people like you." As the months passed, Greg's disciplinary case concluded with his suspension and mandatory enrollment in a rigorous retraining program. The department also implemented new policies, including enhanced oversight and bias training, as a direct result of Jasmine's advocacy. For Greg, the journey was far from over. But as he worked to rebuild his career and his integrity, he found himself reflecting on Jasmine's parting words: "Arrogance is a weakness, not a strength." They stayed with him, a constant reminder of the man he had been, and the man he hoped to become. For Jasmine, the fight for justice continued. But as she walked through her city one evening, past murals painted in honor of those who had suffered and fought before her, she felt a quiet sense of triumph. She had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change, proving that even in the face of adversity, resilience and courage could light the way forward. Months after the storm of controversy, Greg Simmons sat in his car outside a modest community center, gripping the steering wheel as if it were his last lifeline. His suspension had ended, but returning to the force had been anything but simple. He was a different man now, or at least trying to be, but redemption was a heavy weight to carry. He stared at the crumpled business card in his hand, the name Jasmine Carter printed neatly in bold letters. The card wasn't just a reminder of his mistake, it was an invitation. Greg had resisted calling her for weeks, fearing her reaction, but he knew it was time. Summoning his courage, he dialed the number. Jasmine sat at her desk, reviewing proposals for a new community outreach program, when her phone buzzed. Seeing the unfamiliar number, she hesitated for a moment before answering. "Agent Carter speaking," she said, her tone professional. There was a pause on the other end. Then came a familiar voice, softer and less brash than she remembered. "Jasmine, this is Greg Simmons. I hope I'm not interrupting." Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. She leaned back in her chair, her voice calm but curious. "Officer Simmons. This is unexpected." "I know," Greg admitted, his words coming out in a rush. "I've been wanting to reach out for a while, but I wasn't sure you'd even take my call." Jasmine let the silence linger for a moment before replying. "I'm listening." Greg exhaled deeply, as though he had been holding his breath. "I wanted to apologize. Not just for what happened that day, but for everything, the way I treated you, the assumptions I made. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I need to do better. I need to be better. I was hoping you might help me figure out how." Jasmine's expression softened, though her tone remained measured. "Words are a start, Greg. But what matters is action. If you're serious about change, I can point you in the right direction. The rest is up to you." Over the next several months, Greg threw himself into the work of self-improvement. Jasmine connected him with organizations specializing in diversity training and community engagement. One of her first recommendations was a program called Bridge the Gap, which brought law enforcement officers and marginalized communities together for open dialogue and collaborative problem-solving. Greg attended the sessions with a mix of trepidation and humility. The stories he heard from participants, Black mothers worried for their sons, young men recounting unjust arrests, and families scarred by systemic bias, were raw and unfiltered. Each story chipped away at the defensive walls Greg had built around himself, forcing him to confront the impact of his actions and the broader failures of the system he represented. He also began volunteering with youth mentorship programs, spending time in the same neighborhoods he had once patrolled with suspicion. Building relationships with the community wasn't easy, especially given the mistrust he had contributed to, but Greg was determined to earn back their faith. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued her advocacy work, balancing her duties as an FBI agent with her growing role as a public figure pushing for reform. Her efforts bore fruit. The police department implemented new policies aimed at reducing racial bias, including mandatory implicit bias training, a civilian oversight board, and community policing initiatives. While the changes weren't perfect, they were a step in the right direction, and a testament to the power of accountability and persistence. Jasmine kept tabs on Greg's progress, occasionally checking in through mutual connections. She saw the photos of him working with kids at the community center, leading discussions at Bridge the Gap, and even attending protests, not as a cop, but as an ally. Slowly but surely, he was earning back respect. One sunny Saturday, Jasmine arrived at a community event she had helped organize. The event, titled Pathways to Progress, brought together law enforcement, activists, and local residents to celebrate collaboration and discuss the ongoing journey toward equity and justice. The air buzzed with laughter, music, and the smell of grilled food as families gathered under colorful tents. Jasmine spotted Greg near a table labeled Mentorship Matters, talking to a group of teenagers. He was smiling, gesturing animatedly as the kids listened intently. It was a sight she wouldn't have believed possible months ago. Greg noticed her watching and excused himself from the group, walking over with a cautious but genuine smile. "Agent Carter," he said, his tone lighter than before. "Thanks for coming." "Wouldn't miss it," Jasmine replied. She folded her arms, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You've been busy." Greg nodded, his expression earnest. "It's been humbling, but worth it. I'm learning a lot, about the people I thought I was protecting and about myself. I've still got a long way to go, but thank you for giving me the push I needed." Jasmine's gaze softened. "You've come a long way, Greg. But like you said, this is just the beginning." Greg hesitated, then extended a hand. "I owe you more than I can say." Jasmine shook his hand firmly. "You don't owe me anything. What matters is what you do with the second chance you've been given." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the event, Jasmine and Greg stood together, watching the crowd. Children laughed as they played games, officers and residents engaged in genuine conversation, and activists shared stories of resilience and hope. For Jasmine, it was a moment of quiet triumph, not just for herself, but for everyone who had fought for justice and progress. For Greg, it was a reminder that redemption was possible, but only through honesty, humility, and a commitment to change. The event ended with a symbolic gesture, a tree planting ceremony to represent growth, renewal, and the possibility of a better future. Jasmine and Greg each took a turn with the shovel, their hands briefly brushing as they worked together to cover the sapling's roots with rich, dark soil. As the crowd applauded, Jasmine glanced at Greg and said, "This is just the beginning." Greg nodded. "I know. And I'm ready." With that, they stepped back, side by side, as the tree stood tall, a testament to progress, forgiveness, and the enduring belief in the power of change.